Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order, June 8th, 2021. And I'd like to ask all of us to Thank you. Roll call.
Commissioner Barbet,
Here.
Commissioner Doan,
Here.
Commissioner Paul,
Present.
Vice Chair Rainey is absent today. Commissioner Ramirez. Here. Commissioner Serrato.
Here.
And Commissioner Weiler.
Here.
Okay, review of the minutes. Does anyone have any comments, questions, concerns, revisions? These are the minutes of the May 25th meeting. Boy, it's not like Zoom where I can see everybody at once. This is like swivel time. No comments? Okay. Is there a motion to pass?
I'll go ahead and move to approve the minutes of May 25th, 2021.
Okay, Commissioner Paul seconds it. Thank you.
Chair Barbet,
We need to, yes, approve.
Commissioner Doan,
Approve.
Commissioner Paul,
Yes, approve.
Commissioner Ramirez. Approve. Commissioner Serrato,
Approve.
and Commissioner Weiler.
Yes.
Thank you. The vote is 6-0 to approve, and Vice Chair Rainey is absent.
Thank you. It's my understanding that there are no written communications this evening? And Director Strong, are there any neighborhood meetings?
No written communications and no neighborhood meetings to report. Thank you.
And oral communication?
No, there are no oral communications.
Okay, and we don't have a public hearing this evening, so we go straight to current business. And the first item of our current business agenda is the Capital Improvement Program consistency analysis. And staff is going to provide an informational report.
Yes, thank you, Chair Barbet. This is Director of Community Development, Mike Strong. And this item is pertaining to a requirement under state law that the planning agency for local governments review and determine conformity with the CIP budget to the general plan. And the scope of the authority that's been delegated specifically to this task, which the Planning Commission serves as the planning agency for the city of Escondido, is to review the CIP list just specific to that task, so general plan conformity only. The authority to review the elements of the actual CIP list is reserved for the city council themselves. But the staff report identifies 11 categories included in the CIP budget, and those topical categories are referenced to different general plan elements, and then an attachment to the staff report includes all the relevant goals and policies that are applicable to making that determination. City staff has reviewed the assignment to help determine conformity and has made that requisite finding, and as a broad statement or general statement, coordinating the CIP to local growth or how the conveyance of sewer or drainage or the mobility of cars or people is all an implementing task of the general plan itself. This is the first time that I can think of that the Planning Commission has been asked to make this determination, but it is something that the Planning Commission will be asked to review on an annual basis moving forward. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation and available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Questions from the commissioners? Seeing none, is there a motion to, we need to make a motion on this, right?
Yes, there's Resolution 2021-09 is included in the agenda packet, and that would be the action being requested of the commission.
Can we have a discussion first?
Absolutely, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I didn't really have a question.
Oh, okay.
but I had a couple concerns. So I looked at the capital budget, and and I don't know that this is what we're supposed to be commenting on, because it's not really about consistency with the general plan. But there are some items in the capital budget that don't seem like capital expenditures. They're personnel and maintenance items. And I just wanted to point that out, that those shouldn't be capitalized, I don't believe. You know, graffiti removal and routine maintenance.
If I could respond to that. So there is a operational budget that the city council adopts, which does include employee services and other maintenance obligations of the city. And then there's the capital budget, which includes programmatic funding from other agencies like the federal, like with the CDBG and ESG. And that's what's actually captured in the CIP, is those annual allocations from CDBG and ESG to fund those specific programs and services, even if it is employee related.
I understand where the funding came from. I just don't agree that it's capital. We're not getting any physical thing from it.
Understood. That's just the process that's been essentially earmarked for the responsible agencies to follow.
So it's external funding that's coming in essentially.
Well, it becomes part of the CIP, usually with multi-year allocations. Things are also reported. A good example is the Climate Action Plan, which was under the purview of the Planning Commission as a recommending body to City Council. That was actually a CIP budgeted item in the previous prior years. So there are elements of studies and plans that may be in the CIP budget itself, and it's not directly infrastructure project only.
Oh, right, but there is an output from that. There's a plan. There's a physical thing that was created.
In that particular case, yes.
Other comments or questions? Discussion item? Okay. Make a motion to approve the resolution as stated as in the attachment. Is there a second? Commissioner Weiler seconds the motion. Roll call.
Excuse me, Chair Barbe, who did the first motion?
I did.
Okay, thank you. Chair Barbe, excuse me.
Yes.
Commissioner Doan?
Yes.
Commissioner Hall?
Yes, approve.
Commissioner Ramirez? Yes. Commissioner Serrato?
Yes.
And Commissioner Weiler?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So now we'll move to the second business agenda item, which is the Housing and Community Investment Study. Staff is going to provide an update.
Sure. Good evening, Chair Barbe and members of the Planning Commission. Good to see you all in person. I've met all of you virtually, and other than Commissioner Weiler, I don't know that I've ever met any of you in person, so it's really good to meet you. My name is Adam Feinstone. I'm the city planner here for City of Escondido. I've got a couple people with me today that will be available for questions at the end here. Lenny Gavino is the project manager for Kaiser Marston Associates. She is, they're the firm that we've selected and that prepared the sector feasibility study. And also Karen Ewell, our housing and neighborhood services manager, is available as well. So once we go through the presentation, if you have questions at the end, all three of us will be available to answer them. So as Chair Barbe stated, this is our next installment on a few workshops and work sessions that we've had on the sector feasibility, on the Housing and Community Investment Study. This one specifically is related to the sector feasibility study. Overview real quick, backing out and looking at the Housing and Community Investment Survey study, I should say, sorry. The study involves three separate documents. One is the housing element update that is currently in process. The East Valley specific plan is also currently being drafted, and then this is the sector feasibility study. So this study is really intended to look at the costs of new development of different housing types and the feasibility of construction of those projects. The agenda, or the schedule, I should say, with regard to the Housing and Community Investment Study, this is also in your in the staff report that you've been provided. But this, as I said, is the fourth meeting that we've had, or discussion that we've had on this topic, or on this study as a whole, dedicated this time to the sector feasibility study. Next week, or in 2 weeks, I should say, at our next meeting, you'll be provided with a draft overview of the East Valley specific plan for review and consideration and discussion item similar to this. And the housing element will also be brought back for consideration and for a recommendation on that document to City Council. Later on in the summer, we will be presenting or providing information on the environmental impact report that's being prepared in support of the East Valley specific plan. And eventually in the fall, that document, the specific plan itself, will be brought back to the Planning Commission for recommendation to City Council. So work study session number 4, related specifically to the sector feasibility study. Basically, the purpose of the study, we'll go through these items, the purpose of the study, then we'll look at the methodology used for the study and the findings that came out of it. We'll finally just discuss briefly the limitations of the study at the conclusion here. So the goal of the sector feasibility study is primarily to address the feasibility of constructing residential development projects. The study also looks at the implications of an inclusionary housing requirement for on-site construction of affordable housing units, and alternately, what type of contribution might be required if a development was to assist in the provision of an affordable housing project somewhere off-site. It's also intended to provide information for the and to inform other elements of the Housing and Community Investments study, particularly at this point the East Valley specific plan, which is still being drafted. So. In 2020, the city hired Kaiser Marston and Associates to prepare the sector feasibility study. The methodology proposed in the study began with a review of the current market trends and collection of data related to the various multifamily housing indicators. They had included current housing inventory, rental rates, property values, and sales prices. KMA then used available market data and their professional experience to prepare long-range projections of demand for residential housing. Following that, KMA worked with city staff to identify a number of residential development prototypes to be analyzed. This included 3 for sale prototypes and 4 for rent products. Finally, KMA prepared pro formas for each of those prototypes to determine the feasibility of construction. Pro formas were prepared for market rate projects as well as mixed income projects, which include a certain percentage of affordable housing units, and of 100% affordable housing projects, which we'll get into a little bit of the detail on shortly. The residential prototypes were selected based on recent experience and industry trends. They are all multifamily product types that have either recently been constructed, are under construction, are currently being reviewed, or are reasonably anticipated to occur here within the community. Housing types range from townhomes, similar to the projects that you've recently reviewed and provided either approval or recommendation on down on South Escondido Boulevard. I think there were 2 of those in the past 6 or 8 months. And all the way to larger projects, which would be like stacked flats over podium or subterranean parking. The townhomes usually are somewhere around 20 units per acre. The highest density of those stacked flats over subterranean or podium parking, those are typically projects that might be up to 100 dwelling units per acre. That's kind of the gamut of the product types that we would expect to see here, and you can see them on the screen as well. So the pro forma model used to determine the financial feasibility of constructing the various projects use a comparison of what is called residual land value, comparing that to the typical cost of land. Residual land value compares the value of property after it is developed to the cost of the development. However, it excludes the cost of the land itself. The residual land value is what is left after all other costs are paid, and if it exceeds the land cost, then it is feasible that the project, that the analyzed development could be constructed. So residual land value exceeds what is anticipated as land cost based on what a landlord or property owner, I should say, may be expecting to receive. then it could be determined that the project would be feasible to develop on that site. The appendices for the sector feasibility study provide a very detailed analysis of the costs and profits associated with various prototypes analyzed. A very simplified summary of the findings of the analysis is contained in this table. Of the 3 for-sale product types analyzed, only townhomes were determined to be financially feasible. Of the 4 for-rent product types analyzed, all but the stacked flats over podium or subterranean parking were determined to be feasible. The study then built on the results of the analysis conducted so far to determine if any of the prototypes would be feasible if an inclusionary or affordable housing requirement was added to it. The model looked at levels of affordability, which included 10% of units in the for-sale projects being restricted to families qualifying as low income, and 10% of the for-rent units being restricted to families qualifying as either low or very low income. This analysis revealed that the only product type that remained potentially feasible, including an inclusionary housing requirement, would be the for-sale townhome projects. Finally, KMA also analyzed what the impact of the KMA also analyzed what the impact to development might be if, rather than constructing affordable units on site, the for-profit or the market rate development contributed funds for the construction of an affordable housing development off-site. The analysis assumed that the affordable housing developer would be able to receive 4% low-income tax credits, and that the affordable housing project would be limited to those who qualify as very low income, with average incomes at approximately 45% of AMI being area median income. After the tax credits, there would be a financing gap of approximately $148,000 per affordable unit, meaning that the affordable housing developer would have to find a source of funding to cover that gap. Circling back to the market rate development projects, this would equate to the contribution of $14,800 per market rate unit, assuming that it is being paid in lieu of a 10% inclusionary housing requirement. So for each, assuming a 10% requirement, each market rate unit would then have to basically achieve $14,800 of excess profit in order to offset the money that it would take to construct the affordable unit there. So there are various limitations to this study that I wanted to just briefly touch on. The study cannot be assumed to hold true in all situations at all times. It does depend on various property-specific considerations, which can't be known until specific property is analyzed. And it should be noted that it provides a point-in-time analysis that changing market conditions will necessarily affect the feasibility of any project. For instance, construction costs have skyrocketed since the data was collected less than a year ago, and interest rates have also slightly risen. Sales prices for homes, though, have increased dramatically as well over that same time. These things all play a role in the feasibility of a project, and a developer must consider them when determining whether to pursue the project. Other limitations of the study relate to the potential long-term impacts and implications of the COVID-19 pandemic and other factors that might affect the local, national, or global economy. The study is fiscal in nature and does not address political considerations, so project approval is not a question at this, as it relates to this study. It is assumed that all projects would be approved. Other limitations are described in the document itself. That concludes my presentation. As I mentioned, I've got Lenny Gavino with Kaiser Marston and Associates, and Karen Ewell, our Housing and Neighborhood Services Manager here. The three of us are available to answer any questions that the Commission may have.
Questions for staff? Commissioner Paul?
Yes, thank you. Hey, this is a great report. I like it a lot. I have a couple of questions. One is how you picked the size of the units to compare. Like, why are the stacked flats not the same for rental as for sale? One's 900 and one's 820. You know, I'm just curious about that kind of methodology.
Good evening, Chair Barber and Commissioners. My name is Linny Cavino with Kaiser Marston Associates. And your question is how we went about choosing the kind of physical description for each of the prototypes. We looked at other projects that we've seen in the marketplace. We also discussed with city staff some of the projects in the pipeline to come up with some of the unit sizes that we assumed in our analysis. One of the things we assumed is kind of just the density of the actual project itself. So something like a stacked flat in an urban environment would probably have smaller units than a stacked flat over tuck under, which is probably not as an urban environment. So those are kind of considerations we had.
And then, I know it's in your report, but it wasn't in the presentation. You talked about if there was a fee instead would be, you gave an example, $14,800. But that's not the same as the cost that would have cost the developer if he would have included it, right? Because he doesn't qualify for the 4% money and stuff. So how does that compare to what it would have cost the developer to put it in this? I know it's in the whole study, but.
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot. I'll have to find that information, that number, unless you know where it's at.
Yeah, so what Adam alluded to about the $148,000 per unit, that is assuming that affordable housing development is developed off-site as of 100%, and in that case, a market rate developer would potentially contribute or get a fee or so to help develop that project. When we model an inclusionary on-site development, we just run it through the model, we just set aside, in this case, 10% of the units as affordable and just see how that filters out to see what the end residual land value is. And if that residual land value falls within the typical range of the acquisition cost, then we say that would be feasible to include inclusionary in that project. And so within the study, we actually have like percentages as far as the impact on the residual land value from going from 100% market rate to including inclusionary units. So that's how we measure that.
Okay.
And Commissioner Paul, just to kind of further expand on that, to make it very clear, this is not a nexus study, which is typically prepared for establishing or creating an inclusionary program with an in lieu fee. So we'd actually have to run through a separate analysis to iron out some of those details. This was a disclosure of informational purposes only, just to understand the financing gap behind it. Those cities that have pursued in lieu fee programs do look at the costs without the 4% tax credit allocation. So it's truly a market rate development, and then what the subsidy or the delta is between the two calculations. And then the council considers if that cost, the affordability gap that's created is a proxy to an in lieu rate. But most agencies that I've seen acknowledge that it doesn't accommodate the land acquisition costs, because really we're looking at just the difference between the cost between a market rate unit and then the financing gap to a lower income unit, but it doesn't include the price of land as a factor. So that's something that would have to be evaluated concurrent with that separate study, but this is not intended to serve as a true nexus study.
Really helpful, thank you. Other questions for staff?
I do.
Commissioner Doe?
Can you elaborate in the section feasibility study, what does it mean by 100% affordability?
Sure. So that is basically referring to a product that is a 100% affordable housing product. So it's an affordable housing project that is exclusively for low-income residents. It's not putting affordable housing units into a market rate project.
Okay. And the 4% of low income rate is what is the amount based on that 4%?
So the 4% is actually has to do with the financing of the project. The affordability is based on a certain percentage of area median income. So it's broken down, individuals making 80% or less of the area median income are considered low income, and then it tiers down from there. I think it's 50% is very low, and I think extremely low drops down to 30%, if I remember correctly. But if you have more detailed specific questions on that, Karen Yule can provide some information for you.
Right. Thank you.
Questions for staff? Commissioner Weiler?
Thank you. I noticed that the study didn't have an analysis or include in the report single-family development. Is that because, what's the reason? I don't
Sure.
want to assume.
No problem.
Thank you.
So the report is really geared towards where our housing growth is anticipated to occur and where we are kind of looking at getting the extra units, so to say, that we would need to meet our RENA numbers. A lot of that is hypothetically potentially going to be in the East Valley area, and these are more of the product types that we potentially would see down there and in the downtown area. It's kind of the infill type development.
Thank you.
Chair, if I may. It might be good to revisit the benefits or rationale of the basis of this study and how it relates to the other prongs of the Housing Community Investment Study. So the city is under obligation to prepare and update its housing element. And in the housing element sites inventory, there's about 1,000 total units for single-family home construction. So it's a pretty small piece of that RENA pie that we're under obligation. There's 9,600 units that we have to plan for, and the draft housing element suggests accommodation of about 11,000. So a significant majority of those homes are going to be multifamily construction, and that's very indicative of what we're seeing throughout the region. I think Sandag regularly advertises 80% of the homes to be built over the next 30 years are all going to be multifamily units. So that certainly is the market trend. So through the identification of a need to rezone to accommodate sites, we also prepared this East Valley specific plan, which is underway and will be presented on the June 22nd meeting. So this really is an exciting opportunity to bring in the sector feasibility study to understand a little bit about the dynamics between everything. The housing element needs to make sure that there are no, well, it should identify all potential or actual governmental or non-governmental constraints. So any fees or exactions imposed by the city, the CFD, we hear as an imposition of a constraint. This sector feasibility essentially studies if it truly is making projects infeasible. And if it is determined that way, which it isn't, we would have to find ways to mitigate that or make it so we're not constraining housing development. The East Valley specific plan is a new rezoning program, so it's a good opportunity to understand if there's any zoning limitations that might frustrate the viability of new projects. And as we saw, Stack Flats is one of the prototypes that doesn't work. So the development standards that are being developed are to facilitate the viability of implementing the plan. So the zoning regime that's being created is intended to facilitate the prototypes that actually work. Now, this is the really neat part and why things all come together. So we have a sector feasibility study that helps flesh out some of the inclusionary programs that are policy-driven issues. But from an economic development standpoint, with the new rezoning program, there's going to be a tremendous new opportunity for sites to be rezoned. So now we have this sector feasibility study that we can use as a tool to market the city of Escondido and this rezoning program to prospective developers to show them how much money they would make by doing business in the city of Escondido. Secondarily, a lot of emphasis is in building housing for accommodating all segments of the population. And Karen's here tonight to answer any questions if needed about those types of services or how the city can get involved with bridging that financing gap. But this shows exactly how the city can be engaged in those conversations, so we can similarly reach out to the affordable housing development community to show how we can leverage partnerships to make their projects feasible. So altogether, it helps the planning process between the two studies and plans that the Planning Commission will review. And then the sector feasibility study also gives a chance for the city to market itself so we can actually implement those plans if and should they be adopted. So it really helps tie a lot of the things together, and it's going to be a very instrumental piece to market the city moving forward.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff?
Not questions, but can we hear about the program? About what's happening already and
So hi, my name is Karen Yule, and I'm the Housing and Neighborhood Services Manager. And one of the most fun parts of my job is that I get to encourage some affordable housing development here in the city. So we actually have currently 2 sources of funding that we use to help to subsidize affordable housing in the city. We get federal home funds, and that all has to be used to create new units, whether that's new construction or acquisition and rehabilitation, kind of a conversion to affordable products. We get about $600,000 per year of home funds, plus this year with the American Rescue Plan, we've actually been told that in the fall we will get another allocation of home funds of about $2 million. So that's kind of exciting. Right now we do have one project that's in the pipeline for our home funds. We're working with the San Diego Habitat for Humanity to build 10 for sale units to low-income families. And that project will go up on El Norte Boulevard. And then we also have some recycled redevelopment funds. So when the redevelopment agency was active, we would get 20% of the tax increment that was reserved for affordable housing. And that actually has a little bit more variety of things that we can do with that funds, including some homeless programs, as well as affordable housing units. But that money varies. The money that we now get is based on repayment of various loans that the city has made, whether those were first-time homebuyer loans, we did some rehabilitation loans, as well as developer loans to create affordable housing. Excuse me. So in the pipeline right now, we've conditionally committed funds to National Core and San Diego Community Housing Foundation. It's the first time we're working with them. It's a partnership. And that project, as we get to the point of being able to do a final commitment of funds, is anticipated to be a 50-unit project that will serve older adults. About half of the units will be reserved for formerly homeless adults. And there we have, again, that's 50 units and $4 million into that. Then additionally, we are looking at the permanent local housing allocation, the PLHA, and that funding is based on that $75 recording fee that was passed several years ago. The money that we actually received grant-wise for the sector feasibility and the whole work product is from the first year of that funding, and from year 2 and onwards, the city's been allocated a certain amount of money for that, so we're beginning to gear up for our plan on that one, and that is anticipated over the next 5 years to provide about $5 million of affordable housing dollars.
Karen, while you're still there.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Commissioner Paul, and then Commissioner Weiler.
What's the timing for the project on El Norte?
We're working on our final affordable housing contracts, and if I am correct, they're actually up to being just about able to pull their permits in the next month or so. And then typically habitat construction takes a little bit longer than normal construction, but I think within the next 2 years, those families will get to move in.
As a follow-up to that particular project, what are the restrictions for the ownership as far as when they can resell the unit, and how much equity, I guess, can be built upon those particular units?
Okay. So a for-sale product, we hold those as affordable for 45 years. So the loan that we've made to Habitat will be partially reconveyed to each of the homeowners so that there will be kind of a restriction upon resale for that 45-year period. One of the reasons we really like working with Habitat is we'll have a service agreement with them so that they help with the resale of each home, so that the new family is also low income, and they actually will put in much of the same sweat equity type activities as the original family. They all go through the program and benefit from the program that way.
Other questions for staff?
I do have a couple questions.
Commissioner Dodd?
Number one is, thank you, Chair. Number one is the redevelopment funds. Does it have any association with the small home development for homelessness, or no?
No, that tiny homes isn't.
I'm sorry, yeah, you're right,
isn't
tiny home.
Yeah, isn't necessarily something that would be allowed or not allowed with the redevelopment dollars. We haven't particularly developed a tiny home model here. We are looking at ADUs and how to encourage ADU
Oh,
usage.
I see, okay. So this portion is part of allowable for the ADU application, is that correct?
So the ADU applications and the ability to construct accessory dwelling units on properties, it's not really related directly at all to any type of affordable housing dollars. There are different grants that we've been given to two different studies, such as the Housing Community Investment Study that this sector feasibility study is part of. One of the other grants that we received, I think it was either early this year or sometime late last year, was the LEAP grant, Local Early Action Planning Grant, I think is what it stands for. And part of that grant money that we received was in order to prepare like prototype plans, off-the-shelf plans for ADUs. So basically you put this on a site plan and here's your plans. You don't have to have plans drawn by an architect, etc. So that's one of the things we're doing with ADUs, but it is a separate situation than the affordable housing projects or products that Karen's been talking about. It's just that the funding for development of that is grant funding in the same manner.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Discussion? Hearing none? Okay. Our action on this is just to receive and file, correct? So we don't need to make a motion. All right, thank you. And thanks to staff, great presentation. Appreciate your following up and answering our questions. All right, next item. Okay, right, green infrastructure planning. Commissioner Paul asked me to draft a bit of a framework, if you will, to offer to us for discussion first, and then later on perhaps to include it as a work plan item on our work plan and present to City Council. Director Strong tells me that might be mid-July or late July. So what I'd like to do is just walk us through a little bit about what green infrastructure is, why we need it, the benefits, a little bit of context for an Escondido plan, process of designing the plan, and where might we actually focus for green infrastructure planning, and next steps and a timeline. So first off, next slide, yeah, just to give a quick sense of what green infrastructure is. I think everyone on the commission is likely familiar generally with it. It falls into many categories, and there are many definitions out there. But essentially, it is a suite of strategies and actions that result in green infrastructure, essentially, all the way from, I don't know if you've seen bioswales, greening of sidewalks and roadways, hardscape, if you think of pervious pavements to try to make them less impervious so that water can drain through in terms of water management, landscape, bioretention and green streets, rain gardens, pocket parks, protected areas, restored creeks. Our very own Escondido Creek would benefit from more restoration and greening, which is a natural place. If you think of places like, if you've ever been to San Luis Obispo, they spent a great deal, invested a huge amount to redevelop their creek and all of the area around it, which resulted in an amazing economic opportunity for the city and presents lots of entertainment and restaurants, et cetera, all along this lovely green Avenue, this lovely Green Creek. Other places that have done that type of thing are San Antonio, the Riverwalk. There's lots of examples of this, certainly within the smart growth community with respect to green infrastructure and how it can be really beneficial to the community as well as for many different reasons, which I'll go over a few. And it really runs the gamut, if you could do the next one. So this is just an example for you to look at. This is the permeable paving, just to sort of see how it works. Actually, the water can drain through cement or asphalt or whatever the material is. This is a restored channel down below. These are all, this actually is down in National City, this creek that's being restored to the left there. And on the right is simply an example of green streets. I think in Escondido, we've really made, we already have a lot of these features. However, there's always room for more, and particularly in some neighborhoods that are extremely urbanized and don't have a lot of green streets. I think there's opportunities to improve. In my experience anyway, working at the federal level, I worked with all the coastal states in coastal management, and we were working with this balance of development and conservation. And a lot of our work focused on redevelopment of waterfronts and greening that infrastructure, traditional uses of waterfronts, and highlighting those. And it really has an amazing positive impact on the community, as well as the environmental benefits as well. So if you look at this is sort of sorry, it's a little fuzzy, the green-gray continuum. If you think, say, from Daly Park, Daly Ranch, I mean, as being a protected area to the far left, it really runs the gamut, this green infrastructure of many different types of strategies and actions that you can take, from all the way from green to green-gray to gray. If you even think of parking lots in malls that have trees and bioswales, those are also examples of sort of a green-gray, or industrial parks that have areas where people can go sit and have lunch or whatever, that are green, that kind of a thing. So the idea is to look for these opportunities and build on them. Here's an example, a great example of green roofs. This addresses a number of different benefits from when you think about cooling heat islands, cities as heat islands. These green roofs can absorb carbon. They provide shade. They can reduce the temperature. They really help to bring temperatures down. So on to the next. So why do we do it, or why should we do it? It includes natural and managed green and green-gray areas in both urban and rural. It runs that whole continuum. It's about the strategic connection. It's about being intentional about planning for green space, as opposed to sort of ad hoc and gee, let's have this developer try to put in a park. It addresses what Commissioner Paul was concerned about during one of our conversations around if we build here, if we are offering affordable, some of the waivers that I think we offer result in not the waiver for green space for a developer, that in fact it might impact the quality of life for the inhabitants, the people who actually live there. So the notion here is that we can really help, if we plan for it intentionally, we'll actually have an overall better quality of life for all of the residents in our fair city. One important feature of green infrastructure is that goals are identified and refined by stakeholders. So once you target an area, it's really important to engage all of the stakeholders within that area to both understand what their priorities are, what their interests are, what types of green infrastructure would be helpful, and to have them engage them in the actual process. So here's some of the benefits. This is an EPA slide. They emphasize a lot of, EPA tends to focus a lot on stormwater, but this actually goes a lot broader than that. I really would like to emphasize the mental health and overall health and well-being. I think it's interesting that they really focused on that in this diagram. Water quality and quantity increases infiltration and reduces stormwater runoff and pollution. Flood management, that was certainly an issue for us in coastal cities. If you look at green waterfronts, it actually acts as a buffer between urban areas and the coast in those cases anyway. And here, with climate change, we're going to be having more increased variability and increased storm events, intensity of storm events, even though we're in the middle of a massive drought. But when we do get rain, it's likely to be pretty intense. So we need to plan for how to capture that water, how to make sure that we don't lose it, and also make sure that it's not impacting us in a negative way. Greening the streets, it provides shade, it brings down the temperature, it improves air quality. And apparently there are studies out there that say that as it improves aesthetics, it provides a possible reduction in the risk of crime. Okay, next. Some of the things we need to consider here in Escondido, I think, is that because we've just been hearing about the sector feasibility study, the fact that we're going to be doing a lot of infill, a lot of retrofits, we need to focus green infrastructure that will help to address those sorts of contexts and environments. So we need to think thoughtfully about that. Reflect regulatory drivers and opportunities. We have the climate action plan. This green infrastructure actually relates to a number of different strategies highlighted in that plan. And there'll be funding opportunities that are associated with climate action, both from the state as well as regional. I'm thinking SANDAG, other tied to the regional transportation plan. There's ways to get funding to think about permeable roads or pathways or whatever. Municipal stormwater permit, these are all different issues that the city has to keep in mind as they're doing their planning. And one of the emphases of green infrastructure planning is that and I think once again Escondido has been marching down this path a bit to ensure that as we do more and more green infrastructure, that it simply becomes a way of doing business, so that as developers propose projects, it's simply part of the code, and that becomes sort of the part of way of doing business. Planning and implementation, classic planning process. I think we need to assess what we have, what we're doing, what plans do our current infrastructure projects relate to. Just basically have a good assessment of the current status citywide within our jurisdiction, and also look for overlaps with other jurisdictions where we might be able to partner and do things more systemically. Prioritize geographies, review best practices, identify what strategies we want to implement, find the funding to do it. There's lots of funding sources out there. It's competitive, but because this climate action plan actually presents us with an amazing opportunity, and I'll get to that in just a second. Planning and integration across city departments. I think there's probably ways to look across city departments to see or to see what different departments are doing with respect to green infrastructure and strengthening those links. Implementation of the actual green infrastructure functions, the structure itself. And then, of course, in the center there, I could put arrows in every direction, but essentially you want to maintain education and engagement with stakeholders all the way through, and obviously you want to monitor and evaluate progress. Classic planning. So in terms of where, I just throw this out here as a notion for us to talk about, and also to perhaps toss to the City Council for consideration. In the Climate Action Plan, there are identified what we call priority investment neighborhoods that include the urban core and neighborhoods along the Escondido Creek, and certainly the East Valley specific plan. These PIN neighborhoods are, you could go to the next slide, please. The PIN neighborhoods are all there along you see where it's yellow. This is the Social Equity and Health Index map from the Climate Action Plan. And this highlights where, excuse me, we haven't actually drawn a line around this, but in areas where it's yellow and orange, those are areas that would have a higher priority for investment. And because we have this structure in the Climate Action Plan, we can actually use this as a basis for seeking funding to do green infrastructure in these areas to address climate impacts. Particularly, I'm thinking greening the streets, tree canopy, increasing our tree canopy, and working within those infill kind of areas. the East Valley specific plan, because it's current, and as Mike said, we've got this exciting opportunity to think about it systemically. Why not think thoughtfully about what green infrastructure needs to be in that plan, so that in fact we don't build it out without any green space for anyone, that we ensure that there's quality of life, there's a certain quality of life built into the plan with respect to green space and access to clean air. So that's essentially it. I have this timeline. This is, again, just sort of putting something on the table to consider. August to December. In July, we present the work plan item to the City Council, seek approval and support. August to December, just do that assessment piece of it. Obviously, this is going to cost some money. I think Mike, Director Strong had tagged $100K, I think, for this effort in the work plan. We'll either need to find that $100K or convince City Council to rejuggle things to make sure that we have that funding. Essentially, I assume it would be hiring a consultant to help figure it out. Mapping it's a lot of GIS. There's a lot of GIS activity in figuring out green infrastructure and understanding what our current status is across the jurisdiction, and understanding what's there and being able to map it and highlight it and understand what needs to be done. And then we go through a process to determine where is it that we want to focus our efforts, at least initially, and I'm suggesting the PIN neighborhoods under the Climate Action Plan in the East Valley area as a sort of a pilot, if you will, so that we have an understanding of the whole systemic nature of green infrastructure for the area, but we're actually focusing our specific activities in those areas, or wherever we collectively believe that it should be focused. And then simply continue to implement, monitor, report on progress, and ongoing, of course, is community engagement, reporting out. I think that as life gets back to normal, we can get back to community events where we can highlight some of these actions and engage people, communities and neighborhoods in more lively ways than via Zoom. And so as part of that, actually I wanted to ask about whether or not it's possible to have a subcommittee, Director Strong or Kurt, to establish a subcommittee of the Planning Commission to help think this through and come up with a more complete structure. It's just a question for you guys.
Yes, I actually pulled out the bylaws because I kind of foresaw that maybe you would ask that. According to our bylaws, Article 3, Section A, committees and subcommittees shall be appointed by you, Chair Barbet, at the time deemed necessary or advisable so as to conduct commission business properly. So they're appointed by you. Each committee shall consist of no fewer than 2 and no more than 3 commission members. And they serve for the duration of the committee unless there's a reassignment made by you, the chair. And you, the chair, will fill any vacancy in committees. So those are the rules for the committee.
Okay, thanks. But before we go there, discussion, questions?
I have a question. So the 100K that was marked for that, is that for the entire process, or was that just for the first portion of it?
It wasn't tagged, I don't think.
The work plan was developed to indicate several things of relevance. One was if it was state mandated task, if it was something to implement the climate action plan. In retrospect, we probably would add a lot of the housing element draft items and indicate if that was, an implementation item of the housing element. And in many of those instances, the existing department budget can cover those tasks because it's either with in-kind resources or with staff personnel executing those deliverables. There were several items that did indicate a dollar amount, and that was for the procurement of consultant or third-party services. So a few of those had already been authorized by City Council or were factored into the CIP. There was 2 items that were unfunded. The active transportation plan, which is being forwarded as part of the CIP for consideration, and then the green infrastructure plan. The $100,000 was just an estimate based on the preliminary conversations that the Planning Commission had. So there's no basis other than trying to initiate the discussion and try to formulate an idea of what it could be. The actual costs are going to be derivative of the scope of services, and at that point, it was speculative.
Other questions? Discussion? Thoughts?
I'm really excited about this. I think it's very timely, especially looking at market trends and higher density. I think this is the perfect time to start assessing quality of life and everything so that we don't end up in a place where we become Los Angeles or one of those cities with higher density. Just really think ahead. I would want to do that. Thank you for that.
Commissioner Weiler.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Barbe, for putting together the presentation. I thought it was very good. It walked us through the steps of what is being considered here. And looking at the list of things that are under consideration, and it was kind of the round one there with all the various, that one, yes.
Oh, the benefits, yeah.
Yes, and in looking at this, it seems to me that even with the current ordinances and plans that we have in place today, we cover all of this in addition to what comes out of the state through the building requirements in Title 24 and all the energy efficiencies that we have to abide by, as well as the Clean Water Act and having to deal with urban runoff and cleaning that water before it goes into the system. So it seems to me like a lot of this is really already being taken care of. Now, that's not to say that things could be better or different, which in my opinion, and I've expressed this before, that maybe we should be looking at those individual ordinances and plans that are already in place. And if the Planning Commission and City Council so choose, then maybe there are additional items that could be added or changed in those particular plans, as opposed to preparing an entirely separate plan that addresses all of these various things that are currently being addressed, not only from federal, but state and then local codes. So I just wanted to express that. I do, again, appreciate the presentation. It was very well done, and allowing me to express my opinion. So thank you.
Yeah, and I do want to, I'd love to reemphasize the fact that I think we're already doing, as you say, quite a bit of this in different areas. I think what a plan like this, or if nothing else, the assessment and the beginnings of a plan, would tie it all together from a green space perspective. I don't think necessarily that when you're doing a specific plan that you're thinking about all of the little green space opportunities or green infrastructure opportunities within a given area, and whether or not the ordinances that will actually address that. So it might well be that some of it's there, and that's what the assessment is about. So perhaps, perhaps we'll find that there's not a huge need to do that much more. I'm not sure. But I think the first step is to understand what we have and where it all fits together. My opinion, anyway. Okay. So then getting to the subcommittee thing, my thought was that it would be great if we had a subcommittee to work on this, given that this is, at least it's not currently like an active item within the work plan of the planning department, that we, a subcommittee, could help sort of shepherd it along, could be engaged, could be involved, and I'm thinking specifically about the engagement strategies that we might use with the priority areas that we might target. To look at some perhaps new, different ways of reaching out to, particularly I'm thinking these PIN neighborhoods, the priority investment areas, to make sure that they're truly engaged in a way that, especially given the fact that we're coming out of the pandemic, it's, in my mind, an opportunity to start a new and a fresh and a different way. So my proposal would be is that we have, I'm happy to take the lead, and would work with someone who would be interested in volunteering, particularly with respect to engagement, those strategies, as well as helping with the overall approach in working with the planning department.
So is that a little bit premature since it hasn't been presented to the city council yet? Or would
Well,
the
yes.
subcommittee create a more in-depth analysis for the city council and then disappear?
What I would like to suggest is that we have a subcommittee to at least come up with a more informed and perhaps, I don't know, more detailed proposal, so to speak, for the council to consider. I don't think it needs to be too much more than this at this point, but a little bit more. And then someone who also is interested in carrying through, should the council approve. If they don't approve it and they don't want us to go forward, then we simply will, as the chair, I can cancel the subcommittee. So it would be a subcommittee to get it going at least through that point, if that makes sense. Yeah? If that makes sense to you. So I'm not doing this alone. I have some other people to talk to about it, as well as the planning department. So is there anyone interested?
I'm sorry, and that would, so the subcommittee would be supported by staff?
I would expect the subcommittee would work with planning department folks to some degree, yes, if that's okay.
It is not approved by the city council yet.
Oh,
That was why I was bringing it
My
up as
apologies.
maybe being premature.
I'm sorry, perhaps I misunderstood. So, go ahead.
Chair, if I may. So I think to establish some
Parameters.
criteria to establish the framework in which the subcommittee could operate, the commission as a whole has adopted the proposed work plan. It seems like the subcommittee could establish an expanded scope of what it might entail and present that to the city council concurrent with the rest of the work plan, provided that that scope is similar or not exceeding the express authority of what the planning commission voted for previously with the work plan, meaning that the subcommittees aren't just inventing something that the whole commission is not endorsing.
Right.
So that seems to be a legitimate use of the subcommittee's work. Staff can certainly facilitate limited resources for that effort, and until city council adopts the work plan with this item included, could then allocate more of our time. But yeah, I think the first goal for that framework is getting to the city council and presenting the concept.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think when I think about planning staff, it's more of just a couple of conversations to get a better sense of how this might actually play. Because at this point, I'm kind of flying blind, if you will. So it's the sense just to get a little bit more depth and understanding. I think it would be perhaps a few conversations.
And, you know, it was funny that Commissioner Paul brought that up because I was thinking kind of the same thing, that maybe we were putting the cart a little bit before the horse before this was presented to City Council so that they could authorize, if they so chose, to begin this implementation and allow for staff to commit some resources towards this subcommittee. So I agree with Commissioner Paul that you know, maybe we should wait and see what council says before we actually put together a subcommittee and started actual work with city staff. I'm not entirely against putting together the subcommittee itself, because like you said, you know what, city council says no, then you just disband the committee and it's all over. The concern, though, would be staff time, the allocation of staff time, and what that might take away from some of their other duties.
Okay. Other comments?
Yeah, I think it would be worth having a subcommittee to give a proposal to the city council. That way it's a little more in depth and we can have greater conversations about it.
Commissioner Dunn, do you have a comment? So, two commissioners have said, no, don't do the subcommittee until we speak with city council, is that correct?
No, I didn't say don't do the subcommittee. I said don't
That's
use
what I-
don't use staff talk
Okay,
before the city council approves it.
okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
All right.
and that's exactly how I feel as well.
Okay, all right.
I do have a question. So, I do like the plan, and I agree with Commissioner Weiner that some of these have already addressed in some of the ordinances at the city of Escondido. But this is a plan that pulled everything together in one place for us to identify what we need to do, what we should be looking at into a benefit of green infrastructure. As far as, let me phrase it this way, not that we need to utilize the city staff, but we just need something to help to develop the subcommittee to come up with a good, solid material before we can present it to the city council for approval. I think that's what you're asking, right? It's not the leading of the city staff, the planning staff to lead us, but to have probably some conversation of where we're going, what we need to do. So that subcommittee can form in the way that we have a structure so we can present it to the city council members. That's what I'm thinking. What you're saying, correct?
Correct, yes. My thought was simply to have a couple of conversations, not in depth and certainly not to take too much time, staff time, but simply to get a better understanding of the various elements, where they are currently within all the plans, et cetera, and where we might need to go, that's all.
May I just intervene, Chair Barbe? I don't see any legal impediment to creating the subcommittee, just to be clear, and there's no impediment within our bylaws. It's certainly within the Planning Commission's authority to create the subcommittee, but I'm hearing people's concerns about staff time, including Director Strong, pointing out that limited resources should be devoted to this subcommittee prior to the city council actually, giving the final thumbs up. So my advice would be just to form a subcommittee under the parameters that Director Strong is comfortable with respect to staff.
I'd appreciate that. That makes sense. Okay. And so, Commissioner Ramirez, if you want to be on, that's two. Anyone else? Anybody else? Okay, so be it. Commissioner Serrato, Commissioner Ramirez, and I will be on the subcommittee to work up a more informed proposal to the City Council at whenever it makes sense. And we will consult with Director Strong to determine just how much time that he and staff can direct to this. Thank you so much.
Would you like a voice vote on that?
Sure. Roll call, you mean? That kind of, sure.
Someone want to make a motion on it to do the vote count? Or do we need to do that?
No, I don't think we need to. I think that's it. Chair appoints, and no other commissioners need to vote on that.
So thank you very much. So, other discussion, or no more oral communication? No? Any other general comments, concerns?
I have a question. What does this mean in terms of the Brown Act and how
Yeah, I mean that was going through my mind too, of how this works. That's why we have the rule of no more than 3, because that's less than a quorum, less than a majority, and therefore you don't violate the Brown Act if you're just keeping within your subcommittee. Obviously you're not going to be pulling other commissioners into that. But if you have specific questions with the subcommittee, I'm willing to answer those. How the subcommittee should operate with respect to the Brown Act. I could advise you on that within the context of the subcommittee.
Just as a follow-up to that, so does that mean that the subcommittee members should not be discussing anything that they talk about in the subcommittee meeting until they get before the full body or at least a quorum at Planning Commission? Is that kind of what that means? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, so the three of us would work on this in isolation, if you will, of the other planning commission members, and it strikes me that it would only seem reasonable to run it by the entire commission before we go to the council. At least have you all comment on it before we present to the city council.
Got it. All right, thank you.
All right. Any other comments, concerns, questions for the good of all? So nice to have everyone in person, and so nice to finish at 10 after 8. The meeting is now adjourned.